Am I good to go?
Good to go.
Okay, so hi, I'm Sunshine Flores. Some of y'all know me, some of y'all don't. So my honors project was a research study. I'm studying the gender biases in autism diagnoses. So what this means is a lot of autism diagnoses are overrepresenting males right now because a lot of the symptomology, which you can see over here, the National Mental Health Institute describes some general autistic symptoms like social communication, interactive issues, restrictive or repetitive behaviors, and other disruptive symptoms. A lot of this research, however, comes from research done only on young white males, which that's a big demographic. They do need their research, but that's the only research, and that's what a lot of current diagnosing is based off of. And it's not super fair because females are more likely to go undiagnosed in childhood, as well as more likely to present their autism differently from males in childhood. The way autism presents is called the phenotype of autism. So that's going to be the symptoms that the person displays, the way that their disorder is manifesting in their everyday life, and just sort of how it looks. So the idea behind my study was to find primary sources on the real-life effects of this diagnosis bias on autistic females and to look at the unique challenges that they face. Such as, it's been reported that autistic women actually experience their symptoms more intensely as they get older, so it gets worse basically. But for autistic men, they tend to report their symptoms lessening or even sort of going away. Also, while girls with autism tend to be more socially adept and good at mimicking social norms, this is called masking, as in masking one's autism, which we're going to talk about a little bit later. While they're really good at these social mimicry, they report having a lot more breakdowns and disruptive behaviors at home out in the public eye. And that's part of the difference of the phenotype. The phenotype for boys for autism tends to be a lot more disruptive in public. A lot more outbursts, can't sit still, maybe fighting with other children, that sort of thing. So it's a lot more publicly disruptive. Whereas the female phenotype of autism is a lot quieter, a lot more self-contained. These are not girls that you would necessarily look at and go, oh, something's wrong. They may just look like a weird girl. So for methods and materials, I had 6 subjects. Amber, 36 from Pennsylvania, Carrie, 20 from Oregon, Caitlin, 25 from Ohio, Melanie, 20 from Singapore. She was my only international participant because I thought it would be interesting to kind of get that diversity in there and see if maybe she had some different experiences. And then there's Shannon, 27 from Massachusetts, and Sydney, 29 from Arizona. These people were found through a neurodivergent themed Facebook group. And I had made a post discussing what my study was and asking for participants who are assigned female at birth, which all of these people are, but subjects 1, 2, and 6 identify as non-binary. I will be referring to them using they, them pronouns, just so everybody knows. But they are all assigned female at birth. They all have an official autism diagnosis, and they've all had some sort of mental health treatment for it. So those were my criteria. My interview questions, they had dialogic, unstructured interviews. The questions were developed based on my literature review, and they were intended to measure how the participants felt about their diagnosis process and experiences as autistic females. So the questions included stuff like, when did you start the process of getting an ASD or autism spectrum disorder diagnosis? How would you describe the process? Or in what ways did you conform your symptoms to those around you, which is a question about masking. Each question also had a subsection of follow-up questions that were asked verbally in Google Meet sessions and on paper to participants who typed. So all 6 interviews were administered in English. They were done through Google Meet. 2 interviews included writing straight from the participants for accommodation reasons, because subject 2 also has epilepsy and could not handle a Google Meet session with their sensory issues like bright lights, lots of fluorescence, lots of noise and feedback. They just couldn't do it. And subject 4 needed to write because she needed a little bit longer to formulate her answers into English. Each interview lasted about 45 minutes, and all but 1 were able to be done in a single sitting. Subject 1 was the outlier with 2 interview sessions at around 15 minutes each. If you'll remember, subject 1 is 36. They are the oldest of all my subjects, so they had a lot more experience to draw upon, and they are also the subject who had the most autism in their family history. They have an autistic brother, their father is autistic, their grandfather is autistic, and their mother has borderline personality disorder, so they had quite a lot to say in their results. All the data was written long form answers, 4 out of 6 were entirely verbal. The other 2 included the writing straight from the participants. I read all their answers and was looking for similarities along 4 themes that I've highlighted that kind of showed up in these results. Getting diagnosed, their symptoms and triggers, outside reactions and treatment and support. And I compiled this data into simple tables for your viewing pleasure. So, this first table is important ages that came about in the subjects research. So we have all the subjects with their names at the top row, and then we have their ages. And then we have the age of realization, which I have categorized as the age when they've actually begun their journey into mental health. So this is the age where they have first gotten some kind of diagnosis, they first started some kind of medication or some kind of therapy. However, the age of realization is not the age that their symptoms first showed up, because all of these people reported their symptoms showing up in early childhood. So early that they couldn't even remember a year to give me. Like, that's how deep these childhood memories were, and they felt different from a very young age. So age of realization is not when their symptoms showed up. The age of diagnosis is when they actually got their autism spectrum disorder diagnosis. You can see one of the outliers here is subject 3. She was lucky enough to get her diagnosis all in 1 year after starting the process of trying to get it. She is also the only participant whose first diagnosis was autism spectrum disorder, which I think came about because she got to do it all in one go. She did it in 2021. I really don't know how she did it. I don't, because that is very not normal, as you can see by all the others, where it's at least 5 years up to 9 years between the age of realization, when they've started getting a diagnosis, till they finally land on their autism diagnosis. Our other outlier is subject 4. As you can see, she started the youngest. She was 13 when she first began her mental health journey. She is one of 2 participants who got a mood disorder diagnosis first. And as you can see, she also got her autism diagnosis the earliest out of anyone. She's the only one who managed to get it in her teens. So, as I said, a majority of the subjects realized some form of symptoms early on, and 2/3 of them got their first diagnosis in their teen years. 50% of them had their first diagnosis of ADHD, 33% had a mood disorder diagnosis first, and then we have subject 3, who was the outlier and got her first diagnosis as autism spectrum disorder. So this is a table related to symptoms and triggers. So sensory issues, what we're talking about here are things like bright lights, fluorescent lights, a lot of noise, big crowds, overlapping conversations, that sort of thing. They create sensory burnout in people with autism. And as you can see, most of my participants, 5 out of 6, reported that their sensory issues did get worse as an adult, which, if you would remember, is actually what the literature said as well. The only participant who didn't say that her sensory issues were worse as an adult is subject 4, who, if you would also remember, is the youngest of the subjects. She is only 20 years old right now, and I would say that I think her sensory issues are probably going to get worse as she ages, and it would be interesting to talk to her in a few years and see if she's followed the trend, because the rest of them did follow the trend. And as for triggers, these are things that would send an autistic person into a meltdown, possibly cause more burnout, sensory overload. The literature says that the triggers tend to stay the same. And you see this sort of in this chart. The only 2 who said their triggers are not the same anymore reported this because they no longer are in situations where they feel they are triggered. Several subjects reported that they don't feel the same as they did in childhood because they have a lot more control over their social life. They have a lot more control where they're going, what they're doing, what they do for work on a daily basis. We didn't have that much control when we were kids. We kind of had to go, do what we were told, do what we had to do. But as we get older, we have more control of our situation. You see that autistic people can start to actually sort of get through their social communication issues because they aren't being so harshly triggered all the time. So as I said, 5 and 6, 83% said they experienced sensory issues in their adult life. They all said social communication was less of an issue because they had more control over what social situations they were put into. And as I said, the two subjects who said their triggers didn't say the same are the only ones who went against the literature, but they also just said they didn't have to deal with the same things that triggered them. So this is my third table, outside reactions. As for masking, that is what we're talking about is in masking one's autism. So you're trying to conform your symptoms to societal or cultural expectations. And it is often at the detriment of the person who has autism. So as you can see, almost all of the participants said that they did have to mask as children and that they do still have to mask as adults. The only one who didn't was subject 1, who was the one who had a very long history of autism in their family, and they said that they felt that they didn't have to mask because it was normal in their family to be abnormal. And so that was the only real reason that they said they didn't have to mask. As for the boys or girls question, that is asking whether or not the participant felt more comfortable being friends with boys versus girls, because the literature was interesting on this. Half of it said that autistic girls are going to gravitate more towards boys because there's less drama, less social niceties that have to be observed. And then half the literature said that girls will gravitate more towards other girls because they can mimic them better, they can model after them better, like model their behavior to be able to mask, and they felt more likely to fit in when they hung out with girls. And as you can see, my results were kind of split. 2 said that they were closer to boys, 2 said they were closer to girls, and 2 just said that they didn't have a preference. So that did also kind of match the literature, even if it didn't really give me any conclusive results. And as for getting bullied, this question was part of the other question about asking how their peers were reacting to them. Most of the subjects, 4 out of 6, reported that they were not really bullied. They were sort of socially isolated. They didn't have a lot of friends, but they weren't openly mocked. The 2 who reported that they were bullied as kids reported a lot of verbal harassment. They didn't report any physical harassment or physical altercations. It was a lot of social alienation, social isolation, being mocked to their faces behind their backs. And you can sort of see that it has an odd relationship with being either boys or either girls. And the results that I got were not conclusive, but the results in the literature were not conclusive, so it sort of fit. Again, 83% said they had to mask. And then most subjects reported that outside reactions to their symptoms were mainly them being considered the weird girl, which I call the weird girl conundrum, because this is when girls are suffering from mental illness symptoms and they're being written off as just being a weird girl, not someone who genuinely needs help, somebody who just has a weird obsession, a weird like for something, like they're just not considered an issue because they're not being disruptive. They're not making a scene, they're not making themselves a problem, they're quiet, they're self-contained, and in public, this is in public. In private, these girls have just as many breakdowns and meltdowns, but in public, they are able to contain themselves to the point where they are hidden from the eyes of administrators and teachers as, again, just a weird girl. Like one of my participants, subject 5, reported that she was the chicken girl in her school. She was obsessed with chickens, had them on all of her clothes, all of her items, talked about them all the time, owned chickens. And it was to the point where she couldn't talk about anything else. She couldn't have normal conversations that weren't about chickens. And that is disruptive to somebody's social life. But because she was self-contained, she wasn't making herself a problem, nobody knew, and nobody gave her any help. And that is, unfortunately, the weird girl conundrum that happens to a lot of autistic women. So this is my last table. It has to do with past and present treatment. As you can see, my only unanimous answer was no, we are not satisfied with past treatment. Every single subject reported either no or completely inadequate support for their autism as children. And if you'll remember, the symptoms showed up as children. They had issues, they felt different from a very young age. They felt their symptoms, and none of them got the help that they felt that they needed. Interestingly, the second question, in need of more, is about future treatment, because all of them are currently in some form of treatment, on some form of medication and some form of therapy. As for in need of more or some kind of change, 4 out of 6 subjects said yes, but 2 said no, and those 2 said no because they feel that autism is not a disorder for them. It is part of who they are as a person. They are not disabled, they are not disordered, they are people who are a little different, and that is why they said, no, I don't want any more treatment than what I am on, I don't think I need any more treatment, which I found really interesting, that, and that these were 2 of the older subjects as well, who had this point of view, and I thought that was interesting, that they said they don't want future treatment because they don't need treatment. So yes, like I said, this question got similar answers across the board. Every participant felt like they got no or inadequate support. And again, to talk about one of my subjects, subject 5, in particular, talked about how she had so many symptoms and so many issues come up. She was actually one of the ones who got her first diagnosis was a mood disorder. They diagnosed her as bipolar. She talked about how she dropped out of high school and she was working in a terribly abusive minimum wage job environment where she was being verbally harassed every day because she struggled too much with her symptoms to finish school, and she felt like it could have been prevented if she had gotten the treatment and support for her symptoms that she needed. And that shows the real problem behind this gender bias in autism diagnoses. It causes undue trouble and hardship for these women because they aren't getting the support that they need because they're not making themselves a problem. They're not making a scene, so they don't need help, right? No, that's not how it is. And as you can see, the lived experiences of these women, they were put through hardship and they felt that they didn't get the support that they needed, and that has affected them in their adult lives. So, as I said, the results show that in the long term, not diagnosing autistic girls creates undue trouble on autistic women. All the participants felt different from a young age. They all have sensory issues. They all had social communication issues. Only 33% of them said that these issues haven't quite carried over into adulthood, but all of them reported they still have sensory issues. They all reported that they had social issues and didn't have many friends. They were isolated in school. Some of them were even bullied. And all but one participant had their diagnosis process take years. All these diagnoses happen way later in life. A lot of the literature will say that these girls are getting diagnosed by 12 and 14. If you'll remember the first chart, no it's not, it's 22, 25, 27. That's when these women are getting their diagnosis, not when it is the worst and when they need the most assistance. And it is also incredibly late compared to how boys are often diagnosed as young as 3 and 4 years old with autism, which is a whole other issue. And these are my references, but as I said, all 6 participants are currently on some kind of medication. They're in some therapy to deal with their symptoms and deal with their experiences, but it is entirely possible that they could all be doing better in mental health if they had the treatment they needed from a young age. And it's not just them. There is an entire community of autistic women out there who have these same lived experiences. And my project was trying to show some of these, so thank you.
Does anybody have any questions?
Well, I was curious, why do the females, those ladies that you had in your research, why did they wait so long? Were they in the process of getting diagnosed, or?
They all, as I said, they reported symptoms happening when they were young. A lot of it was the environments that they were in, the family structures that they were part of. Some had families that were a lot more open to them getting a diagnosis than others. Especially like subject one, I said, had a very long history of like mental illness in their family. So they were able to get their diagnosis a little bit earlier, or like they started their mental health journey a little bit later, but they got their diagnosis a little earlier. And as you can see, it was a lot of getting misdiagnosed first, or getting some diagnosis that wasn't helpful first.
Well, is it expensive?
Oh, yeah.
I was wondering if that's
Expensive, long. They reported one subject, I believe it was subject 6, said that they were in there for two-hour sessions, very long tests. I don't know if you're familiar with the ADOS test, ADOS. It's a really common like inventory for trying to test autistic adults. That takes a very long time to administer. They all reported that it was a very sort of bizarre, invasive process to go through too, because it's a lot of sort of picking apart your brain, a lot of testing, a lot of questions. It was described, like I said, as a very bizarre sort of harrowing process to actually get the diagnosis and go through the tests.
Did they say that insurance covered most or any? Or?
Insurance covered some of them, particularly subject 3, who was able to get her diagnosis all in 1 year. She had the least trouble with insurance, but even then she still had to like redo her I don't know what the word for it is, a claim or inquiry. She had to redo it, and she was the one who got hers the fastest, and even she had trouble. So insurance was a big thing for a lot of them, and I think that's also why some women don't get their diagnosis till later in life when they're able to have more stable insurance plans, as opposed to when they're young and their parents may not have had the proper plans that they should have.
I have a question that's more about the process of your project as a whole, and I think I hope that this is helpful to not just the students who are in on the program, but I was curious why. I mean, there's a lot of different things that you could have done and chosen to do this kind of academic inquiry. And I was curious what drew you to this particular subject, this particular angle on something.
I first found out about this problem, I would probably say freshman or sophomore year. It was a topic that I thought sounded kind of interesting, and the more I learned about it, the more I realized how much of a big issue it is, and how much trouble and strife it can really cause people. And I thought it was really important to get some sort of primary source on that, because there's a lot of literature and there's a lot of numbers, but I think it's really important to learn about the people who are behind those numbers. And these were all people. They all had lived experiences. I talked to them for hours, all of them. It was a very eye-opening experience to see how these biases have really affected people.
If there are no other questions, thank you very much.